So the report that you've prepared is in the bundle for this hearing for the benefit of judges. It's at document 54. In fact, it's 55. It's a briefing paper, and the summary of that is at document 54. Professor Cooper, you're going to speak to that research paper this afternoon. So the first question really is then to ask for your views really about women who were born in the 1950s and whether they were given enough time to prepare for the changes to their pension ages by the 1995 Pension Act. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is one of the aspects of the two Pensions Acts, the 1995 and the 2011 Pensions Acts, that have actually probably received the most publicity. So I just thought I'll talk about a couple of things here. I mean, actually, the 1995 Act wasn't due to come into force until between the periods between 2010 and 2020 to raise women's pensions age kind of gradually to be the same as men, 65 by 2020. So ostensibly, it was like between a 15 to 25-year period. So that did actually look as if there would be enough time for women to think about how they were going to adjust their lives to this, quite significant change. In fact, the real problem wasn't really the notice, it was the amount of warning that women were given and the amount of advice that was actually sent out or not sent out by the government. So, I mean, I'll just give a couple of examples here because I know that this has really been a lot in the press and already well documented, is that in 1995, when the Act was passed, the Department of Work and Pensions decided to print leaflets, and they actually spent £80,000. And I understand this was, 1995, so a good while ago, but even then this wasn't a very large amount. It actually meant that they could afford to publish 47,000 leaflets about a change that was going to affect 3.8 million women's lives. So, I mean, in that sense, that was completely not enough. The other thing about the leaflets is that lots of them were sent to private financial advisors. So they were directed at a certain group that really probably should have already known about these changes, but nonetheless, the government thought it was worthwhile reminding them or letting them know about it. That 80,000 could be compared with a campaign that was run just 6 years later in 2001. Some people might remember this campaign. It was the nodding kind of doghead campaign that was to do with encouraging people to take extra private pensions. And the amount that was spent on that campaign was £6.5 million. So it seemed that if the government wanted to promote something and, they had the resources to do it. So, the difference was just so huge. I mean, the other thing was that if they were really worried about women and them not being aware of the changes, they could have used the 6.5 million campaign to inform women of the change at that point. And at least that would have been, some fairly good notice. Yeah. And there were a few other things. There were supposed to be advertorials in women's magazines, but it's very hard to actually get evidence of the extent of those and, how many were actually published. And probably the worst thing, or perhaps one of the worst things, was that, the government started to kind of get a lot of rumblings throughout the 2000s that women didn't know about this. And so as late as 2009, which was really very late, given that the Act was passed in 1995, they actually began this letter writing campaign. So women that were really expected, to retire, most women, or a lot of women still expected to retire at 60. A woman born in 1950, she would have really expected to retire, let's say, in 2010. The letters that were informing them about that were actually only then sent out in 2009. So for lots of women, the letters arrived really late and gave them very little opportunity, even if they could have afforded it, to actually kind of plan for that. And there are other kind of elements of this which showed that the government really probably didn't take this seriously enough. So letters that were returned back to HMRC that did the mailing, nobody worried that these women wouldn't know. Those letters were kind of basically just destroyed. And then the letter writing campaign stopped in 2011 because the government had plans for actually speeding up the retirement dates of women.
Thank you, Professor Cooper. You may well have answered or at least touched on the next question, which is whether the government was aware that many women did not know their pension age following the 95 Act.
Yeah, so as I said, in the 2000s, there's lots of evidence now that the government did begin to know. And again, this is probably well documented as well, so I'll just point to a couple of key things about this. In 2008, a 6-week pension advisory service helpline was opened up, not only to deal with this issue, but for lots of issues. And one of the things that became very clear that during that 6 weeks was that so many women did not know that their pension age was actually changing, and for that reason they actually continued with the helpline. And the Pension Advisory Service wrote a report which said that only 14% of the women that called the helpline actually knew that the state pension age was likely to rise, and only 2% felt that they had any kind of understanding at all really of the state pension scheme. And then in 2011, the National Centre for Social Research produced evidence from a massive database called the English Longitudinal Study of Aging. And they found that in 2008, fewer than half the women that were in this, and nevertheless, so despite the fact that, I mean, there was compelling research, and even the Pension Advisory Service helpline, noted this problem, the government still proceeded with the 2011 Act.
Well, that was the next question. So that was the 1995 Act, and how it came, not so much how it came about, but its impact. But what about the 2011 Act? Yeah,
so the 2011 Act slightly speeded up the rate at which women would retire. And there was a kind of an interim act that pushed the retirement age for everyone, for men and women, to 66. So, these reforms kind of were speeded up. And so the letter writing campaign started again. And so then there was this really hurt a particular group of women. So women born between the 6th of April 1953 and the 5th of April 1955 that would have expected to retire from 2013 to 2015, they didn't start receiving these letters again until 2012. So some of these women literally had months' notice that they weren't going to be able to retire at 60. They were going to have to wait until 65, and then later some of the women until 66. So this is a kind of an average figure, but for women born, let's say, after 1955, they received on average 2 years, 7 months notice of the change by the HMRC letters. For a man, they actually received 7 years, 6 months notice of the change in their pensionable age from 65 to 66. So there was a kind of a big difference in terms of men and women. Yeah, so the academic research on this since, and probably prior to this actually, kind of said, well, look, women are not of course, not a homogeneous group, and that there were some women that were particularly didn't have the right knowledge about their pension age. And the research showed that these were ethnic minority women, single women, women in low-paid occupations, those not in the workplace, and those with lower educational qualifications. So typically it was the women, often with the least resources to be able to cope with the change, that didn't know about it.
Thank you. And the next question then is, have the government acknowledged the lack of sufficient notice?
Yeah, so this is an issue that I don't know this exactly, but it's definitely been raised in the House of Commons at least 13 times. And it seems that, of course, as we know, nothing really has been done about it. I suppose I could point to two other kind of pieces of information. The question of just the sufficiency of the notice period was subject to a High Court case in 2019. And basically the 2019 case, as far as I understand it, this isn't my area, but, you know, reading the case, it actually said that Parliament could have included an obligation of notice to the individuals affected by these pension changes, but it didn't do so. So in fact, it kind of found that the government wasn't really culpable for not giving sufficient notice, not because they didn't give sufficient notice, but because they never promised that they would. So it's almost like saying, well, you know, I've never told you that I would let you know this, and so it doesn't matter that I didn't let you know. And that's clearly got serious implications for all kinds of future legislation. The other, I suppose, kind of interesting piece of kind of evidence on this is that the government, or the House of Commons Work and Pensions Select Committee, did a very thorough investigation of this issue in March 2016, and their report actually said that previous governments could have done a lot better in communicating the changes. But I suppose what all the other kind of research also suggests is that, yeah, I mean, the government definitely didn't give sufficient notice, and they didn't put the sufficient resources into giving notice, but that actually, just because of structural inequalities, even with sufficient notice, many women probably couldn't have prepared for the changes.
Thank you. I want to turn now to just ask you about the gender pensions gap, and what is the scale of the gender pensions gap?
Yeah, the first thing I should say about this is, and I may have missed it, but I've searched a lot through government information, and I can't find any kind of publicly available government information on the gender pension gap. So this, I don't know this, but it makes me wonder if the government actually have kind of, you know, have good figures on what this is, whether they, you know, care enough to, you know, to collate that kind of information. I might be wrong about that, but anyway, I couldn't find it. So the information that I've found on the gender pensions gap is from a very large scale report that's done every year by Prospect, and it's a kind of a summary report. So they draw research from all kinds of different places. And what they found is that the gender pension gap in 2021 was 40.3%. And just to give you an idea of the scale of that, that means that men's pensions are on average £7,500 more than women's pensions. So in terms of quality of life and the ability to enjoy your life, you know, this is actually kind of completely significant. The other figure so this is just, that's just with pensions. So in terms of kind of like pension savings, the Chartered Insurance Institute also does a report on women's pensions that, you know, produces some really good information. And again, in 2021, the average pension pot for a 65-year-old woman in the UK was just £35,800. And that would be a fifth of the value of the average 65-year-old males. And, contrary to actually what the government said, on which I know I'm going to talk about a bit later, in terms of the 2011 Act, in terms of its gender impact, the Chartered Insurance Institute say that women actually receive £29,000 less state pension than men over a 20-year period. And the other figure that they give that's completely telling is that women's occupational pension income over the last 10 years has risen from £58 a week to £81 a week. So over the last 10 years, you know, women have been contributing more to occupational pension schemes, but men's have gone up from £83 a week to £125 a week. So kind of women are catching up, but, you know, men are also moving on. So there's still a kind of a significant gap. And again, of course, you know, women are, as I've just said, they're not a heterogeneous group. And so the researchers found that, of course, the group that's, you know, fares worse, working class women, women that aren't white, and also women that are unpartnered, either through divorce, widowhood, or never having married. So single women, women that aren't white, and working class women are disproportionately badly affected. So all the figures I've given are averages, but some women are, of course, faring worse than that.
Thank you. And again, I'm not sure if there's anything more you want to say about the reasons for the divergences that you've explained. I mean, I think you've touched on some of them already. Yeah? Yes,
I suppose these are, you know, of course, completely well known. You know, we live in a very, very gendered society from the, you know, the day we're born. Well, I mean, research suggests that before we're born, if families find out the gender of the new arrival, the woman's treated differently, and even from that stage, and definitely as soon as a baby's born, you know, we kind of regender them, and of course that was, you know, of course, you know, things have moved on since women since the 1950s, when, you know, the group that I'm talking about were born. So women born in the 1950s, they kind of, I suppose they arrived, you know, well, their mothers, lots of them would have probably worked in the Second World War, but in the 1950s there was a kind of like a, you know, shuffling people back into the homes again, and it was, you know, a married woman with children working was actually almost frowned upon in lots of cases. So women were kind of born in the 1950s. They were kind of raised to believe that, you know, the natural thing to do would be to get married and have children, and your husband would be the breadwinner. And so, yeah, it was in some ways it was a completely different time from now. Of course, women did a lot work outside of the home, and the research shows that, let's say 10 years after their first child was born, most women were back working at least part-time. So this isn't to say that women, you know, didn't work, but the, you know, the big gap that they would have had while they were having children would have meant that they weren't contributing to their own pension pot. And of course, all of the work that they did in the home was very, very, very valuable, hard, difficult work. It just didn't receive any financial compensation for them to be able to save for pensions. So yeah, so I suppose stopping for family responsibilities, imagining that, you know, you're going to be provided by, you know, by a husband, all of those things actually, of course, even in very subtle ways, would have impacted on women's, you know, not building up a kind of a large pension pot. And of course, even if a woman didn't marry, or, you know, but did marry and had children and worked full time throughout, of course, there was, you know, they would have had less income even in that case because of the gender pay gap. And even as late as 1993, the gender pay gap was still around 30%. And, you know, I know it's less now, but so the average kind of lifetime earnings of a woman would have been about 30% less than men. So that would have meant that they would have saved less. And the more recent research, which is, I mean, probably not really talking to the 1950s women, but just showing that actually things are, you know, how entrenched the ideas that the 1950s women would have had, is that when a woman decides to become pregnant, she's going to be hit many times in terms of the possibility to save for her pension. I mean, just time out with the pension, with maternity leave. If you kind of go back part-time, you know, that's typical things of the 1950s women. It may affect your promotions at work. And what the Fawcett Society actually found was that, yeah, I mean, women often did go back to work full-time, but the way that couples worked out the kind of like the household expenditure is that the woman would pay for the childcare. That was seen still as the woman's responsibility. And the Fawcett Society, when they were doing their interviews, they kind of pushed women, you know, pressed them on this. And they said, but, you know, don't you think you should be saving for your pension? And when they were really pressed on it, they kind of said, yeah, but we kind of, like, we know that, you know, our husband or our partner is actually saving, or, you know, for the pension. So, you know, so the issues for the 1950s women, of course, would have been more powerful than that. So basically, these were a group of women. Of course, the majority of them did all of the things that they were expected to do by society. They worked hard. You know, as soon as they could get back to paid work, they did, even if it was part-time. They take on, like, women, lots of women now in the 1950s have got big responsibilities for aging parents and grandchildren, and they're kind of juggling everything. And then on top of this, then they're kind of accused of not saving enough for their pensions. Yeah, for not knowing, for, you know, being stupid that they didn't realize that there was a change in kind of pension age.
Thank you, Professor Cooper. That's, again, very thorough and very detailed. There's a lot more I could ask you about all of that, and I have so many more questions, but not enough time.